Okay, so the next thing to do is to actually go and attempt to calculate a route between these two locations. And Bing Maps has a web service that we can call in order to calculate this route. And so this opens up the whole topic of trying to call across the network to services from a Silverlight application, which is kind of the reason why I'm including it here. So in order to do this, you need a URL to the service. Now that's actually in the documentation for the Bing Maps stuff, but I thought we'd make it easier than that. So let me just add another link to my list of links here. So I've been to Bitly and I've shortened this link for you as well. So we've got the Bing Maps routing web service, and you can get to that via HTTP. I think I've got it on my clipboard. Yeah, HTTP Bitly Bing Maps route service. So what I'd suggest you do is take that Bitly Bing Maps route service, drop to a browser, drop that into a browser, and then that will give you the proper URL, and you can actually see here is the service information page up at Bing Maps. So I'm going to take that URL now and copy it. Okay, great. And then what I want to do is call this from my application. So I go back to Visual Studio. And in Visual Studio we have this notion of a service reference, where what we do is basically read the description document for that service and generate some code to make it pretty easy to call. So we'll add a service reference here. And we'll paste that address in here. So we just paste that in. Then we call go. And it goes and reads the description of that service from the web. It's found a service called the route service. You can see there's an interface here with calculating routes, which is exactly what we want. So we give this a namespace name. I'm going to call this route service proxy code, because generally what this thing does is it generates proxies to help you call these services, and we'll click OK. And if you're curious as to what goes on with this, if we just let it go through, you'll spot we have a new folder here called Service References with this route service proxy code. In Visual Studio, if you use this button here to show me all the files in my solution, you'll see there's actually a bunch of files in here. And under this reference here, there's this source file, reference.c#. And if we open that, you'll see here's a bunch of proxy code with classes generated from reading that description. And most specifically, most interestingly to us, are these classes like route request, and I think there's a route response somewhere in here which I can't see just at the moment, but we'll see it in a minute. You can see quite a lot of code has been generated for us, and if we just use this little drop down, the most important one would be this one called route service client. This is the kind of the proxy that will actually create ourselves in order to call one of these services. Now, just a word of warning, if you have looked into your file and you find no code like this, there is a potential problem with reading this kind of service description if you are on Silverlight for tooling like I am here and you have a non-US English installation. So if that's the case for you, then let me give you another link, because there's a way to work around it, and I've worked around it on my system here. So let me just go back to my notepad, and let's just say this is web service issue. So if you do see this problem, then go to Bitly Silverlight proxy issue, and that will tell you how to work around it. And then you can run through those steps again once you've applied the workaround, and you will get code like I'm seeing here, because I've applied the workaround myself. Okay, so now we have this class that can do this Bing call for us. As part of making this Bing call, though, we actually need to provide some credentials to Bing. So let's just close our windows so I can run the application. You might have noticed so far, this is okay, don't worry about that warning. You might have noticed so far that with the control we haven't been providing credentials, and that's a bit naughty, but we've been getting away with it. When we come to call Bing's web services, we will need to provide credentials. And so there's a need to just have a developer account. It's very, very easy to do. You go to this link here, Microsoft.com Maps Developers. And so what we can do is just go and spin up a browser. So let's just go and run up a browser. Go to Microsoft.com Maps Developers. And on there we just scroll down and go to the Bing Maps Account Center. And then simply what we do is log in. Now use Windows Live to log in here, so I can just sign in, and I can sign in with my ID. And that takes me to a section on here where I can go ahead and create. Not sure if I'm supposed to share this stuff with you or not, but let's not worry about it too much. I can go ahead and create or view keys. So I already have a key, which I won't share with you here, but I already have a key. What you need to do is create a key if you haven't got one already. So you need to go and do that step. And then what I'll do is I'll just embed that in my source code somewhere and try not to share it with you, so you don't get to see my own private key that I'm using for big maps. You have to create one of your own. Okay, so let's switch back to Visual Studio, where all I've done is added a little class here called keys, and in there I've put a string to store my particular hard-coded key for Bing Maps. So that's really all I've done there. Okay, so let's see if we can actually call this web service. So let's go back to our root data class, and I'm probably going to add a new interaction status, which could be calculating route. And then when the user's selected their end point for the route, so that's just in my code here when they've selected an end location, what I'll do is I'll call a function. Let's write a function here. Instead of setting the status to idle, let's call calculate route. We'll write this little function, calculate route, and this is going to be asynchronous because all network interactions in Silverlight are asynchronous. So what we want to do is, first off, let's say this.interaction status equals, and let's just say interaction status dot calculating route. So we're calculating the route, and then we need to use this proxy code that we have brought in. So the proxy, I think, is called root service client. I think that's what it's called. And if we just go and hover, we can bring in the right namespace to make use of that. Now this is the proxy class that we've just generated. I'll call this proxy so you can clearly see what it is. Now we need to take a little bit of care to construct this the correct way. So as part of the generation process, we will have altered a configuration file. You can see it here called servicereferences.clientconfig. Let's just open that. And what it's given us basically is two ways of calling the service with these endpoints here. We can either call it over HTTP or we can call it with a more complicated version. So we're going to use the HTTP version. So this thing here that says name equals, I'm just going to copy that name, basic HTTP binding iRoute service. I'm just going to copy that, go back to my code, and when we construct this class I'm going to pass that name. That tells the proxy the way in which we want to interact with the service. Okay, so then what we want to do is we want to say proxy dot calculate me a route asynchronously, and you'll notice that this takes a route request. So let's create a route request. So we'll start off by saying route request equals new one of those, and then there are probably some properties that we could set on that request. Let's have a look. So most interestingly, I suppose, is going to be we're going to have to set up some credentials. So let's take a look at that. Let's say equals new credentials, and onto those credentials let's specify my application ID. So this is the ID we just talked about getting from the web, and I put mine into keys dot, I thought I did anyway, bear with me 1 second. Okay, that's better. So this is my own personal Bing key that I'm putting in here in order to be able to use the service. So that's where you would put your hard-coded string. Okay, so that's great. And we set up the credentials on that request. What else can we set up? Well, let's set up some options. So let's say options equals, we can make a new route options here, and on that route options we could specify the mode. Let's say travel mode of walking. We can specify the optimization, minimize the distance probably for walking. Route path type equals points, I guess is what we want. Traffic usage I don't care about, so let's leave that off. So we specified some options, and let's also specify, of course, the waypoints, i.e. where is it you actually want to go. So let's make a new collection of those waypoints. So the IntelliSense is just guiding me through this really. And into that collection, well, what do I want to add? I want to add a new waypoint where the location is going to be this.start location, and another new waypoint. So I'm just initializing a list here with the location is this.end location. So we set up a bunch of stuff. We set up the credentials, we set up some options, we set up the waypoints, and that has given us a route request. I can't speak. That has given us a route request, is what I'm trying to say, which we've called request. So now we should be in a reasonable position to call on the proxy. Let's say proxy.calculate route async with my request. However, this is asynchronous. What we need to do is handle an event on the proxy called calculate route completed. So let's say plus equals, and then we hit tab in Visual Studio, and let's say on route calculated, and then you hit tab again, and Visual Studio throws in a function on route calculated. So this will be called when that has happened. And I suppose the first thing we should really do is we should make sure that no matter what, we set our interaction status back to idle. Otherwise the application won't be usable again. And then what we get is a piece of data passed as a parameter, this event args argument that we get here. And what we can do is have a look at that, and it will tell us if there's an error. So we can say if the error is null, then our call worked. And we can also check some other things in here. We have an e.result, and this is a reasonably complex object now coming back from Bing Maps. It has a response summary in it, which has a status code. So let's check that status code is also good. Then things probably kind of worked. And at this point what I'll do is I'll just place a breakpoint here. So I'm just going to put a little line of code here, int x equals 0, and press F9 to put a breakpoint there, because I want to kind of see, are we doing anything? Is it working yet? So let's press F5 and see what we've got so far. I suppose it would make sense also to place a breakpoint here in case we do get an error. So let's press F5 and see where we've got to, if anywhere. And so we'll go and zoom in on the map somewhere over here. This is fine. Let's click Start Route from here and click End Route to here. We should be calling Bing Maps, and we are, and we've come back. I can use the debugger to see we've not got an error, and our status code is success. So we actually have got a route back, and I can use the debugger here to see on the result that we've got. If we look into the result, you'll see it's a journey with one leg, and we have a route path, and the route path says there are 81 points on this route, quite a lot of points, and I can actually flick through this stuff in the debugger to see that collection of points if I chase it far enough, and there are all the points on the route. So things are working reasonably well. Let's stop debugging, which you can just do with debug stop debugging, and let's take those breakpoints away. So we've managed to call the web service and we're getting a route back. So let's surface that data. And so what I want to do is I want to have a new property on my route data class. So we'll go to the top of the class here and I'll add a property up here. So what I'm writing here is a new property. So I'll write a field for it first. So private field, and we'll use a location collection. Let's call this route points. Then we'll write a property around that. So that's also going to be a location collection. I'll also call it route points. And the get simply returns the field, and the set simply sets the field and also raises the property change for route points. So now we have this location collection, route points. And I suppose whenever you start a new route, I want to set this .route points to be null. So we clear it whenever you start a new route. And then when you have completed calculating the route, so down here in our little callback function, when the route has been calculated and we have success, what I want to do is say, okay, let's make a location collection. Let's call it points. And then what we'll do is enumerate for each, let's just use point in the result, and unfortunately the property again is called result, the route path, and then the points. We'll just say points.add that particular point, and then at the end of the function we'll say this dot route points equals points. So basically take all the waypoints that came in and add them into this new collection and then reset the collection. So we're putting that data somewhere, but we also expect it to show up in our UI. So what did we just call our property? We called it route points. Let's see if we can make that work. So let's go over to our UI, and I'm in the XAML definition here, and we have our map. And onto the map what I want to do is add something. So I'm just going to open the XML tag, and by the way, this my prefix was generated by the tooling so that we can refer to code relating to the map functionality. And if we look at the top of the file, you'll see that there is a mapping between my and the map control, basically. So if we scroll back down to the map, I want to use another thing in here. What I want to do is add to this thing a polyline. And the polyline will have a bunch of locations associated with it. And I want that to come from binding to our route points. So that's kind of what we're hoping for there. Let's go and hit F5 and see where that gets us. So we're running this back up. Let's go and zoom in somewhere over here. We're in London at the moment here, so let's just go and click a start point. Let's click an end point. And I probably haven't set up the right properties on my polyline to draw it, so let's go back and revisit that polyline. And let's make sure we've set up how it's supposed to display. So let's set its stroke to be red. Let's set up its stroke thickness to be, let's say, 3. And let's see if that gives us a red line on that map or not, otherwise I may have broken things. So let's just go and zoom back into London here. Find somewhere to try and draw a route. Let's click Start Route. Let's click End Route. And you can see that we're now drawing a route onto the map. Let's try that again. Let's go to Start Route. Notice that the route disappears. Click here. End Route. Let's go over here. And we're calculating that route and drawing it onto the map. And we got that going along the roads there. So we're doing real work and we're really getting that stuff working. Might be nice to also list the details of those routes. And I think if we just go and take a look at the object model, let's go back over to the code that's working on this. Okay, so the way in which I think we can get some more data is that if we look into e.result. The result again, we can look at the different legs of the journey. I think we just have one. And we can look into this itinerary, which is a collection of itinerary items. And so what we could do is go ahead and make that available as well. So let's add another property to our route data class here. It's much similar to the one we just did a minute ago. So we added, what was it called? Route points. So let's also go and add, what we'll have is just an enumerable thing. I think the class is called itinerary item. And let me just make sure that this namespace is fixed for the enumerable. And we'll call this itinerary. There we go. And we'll have a field to back this as well, enumerable of itinerary item. Call this itinerary. And the get will return that, this dot itinerary. And the set will say this dot itinerary equals the value, and we will raise the property changed event on itinerary. Needed to spell that correctly. And so now we've got this notion of an itinerary. So I suppose when we first start a route, we want to say this dot itinerary equals null. That's cool. And then when the route has been calculated, so calculate the route and get the callback, we want to equally say this dot itinerary equals the result dot. Now I'm going to do something bad here. I'm going to assume there is at least one leg to this journey, and we'll take the itinerary and take that across. So now we've got an itinerary as well, and we need to put this somewhere on the screen. So let's go back to our UI, and I just switched to the designer for a moment and just size that up. We've got our stack panel over here. Let's just make sure we can see that stack panel, and we'll go to the toolbox, pin that out for a moment, and take a list box, and we'll drag that list box over here onto this stack panel. Now we need to deal kind of with the sizing of this, because we don't really want the stack panel to get too big. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that the stack panel that we've got up here has a maximum width to it. So I'm just going to go to its properties. This is on the stack panel, and set its maximum width. And I'll set its maximum width. You can see at the moment it is unconstrained. We'll set it to maybe 2 inches, something like that, which is 192 pixels. So that's kind of setting the maximum width on that thing, so it doesn't sort of get out of hand. And then what I want to do is make sure that that list box is displaying my data. So let's go back over here to the XAML for a moment. Let's find the list box. And the list box has a property on it. And by the way, I don't want a specific width and height on this, so I'll just remove them whilst I'm here. I should have done that in the designer. It has a property on it called items source, and we can data bind that to itinerary, i.e. the items going into the list box come from the itinerary. Let's see how that goes. Let's run the application with F5 again, and let's go and zoom in a little bit up here onto we've ended up somewhere in Exeter, I think. Let's go and mark a route from here to here, and you can see that my list box is displaying the itinerary, but it's not really displaying it properly. It's displaying what looks like the class name, which isn't really correct. And you also notice the list box has moved to its maximum width. I think if we start a new route, you'll notice the list box disappears. We may not want it to work quite like that, but it's okay for our purposes at the moment. So let's fix the display of that list box, and the way we do that is the list box has a notion of what it calls an item template. So we can say we want a list box item template, and that is a thing called a data template. And what we're basically saying is, what do we display on a per item basis instead of displaying that class name that you saw a moment ago? Let's just go back to our code for a second, and let's just check what an itinerary actually looks like. So we have this itinerary here, which is a list of itinerary items. So let's just find what an itinerary item looks like. So I'm just going to go to itinerary item, right mouse on it, and jump to its definition. You can do that with F12 as well. And if you look at an itinerary item, we can see that it has, for instance, this is generated code we're reading here, a location there, it has a summary, and it has some text. So I probably want to display the text. So let's go back to our XAML, and we'll say that what we want to do on a per item basis is display a text block where the text is data bound to the text property on that item. And we could also maybe set up text wrapping on this to say wrap if you need to, and that will kind of do, I think. So let's rerun and see if we get a better display. Now I happen to know we're not going to get a brilliant display here, but let's just see if we get a better display. Let's go and zoom into some area. Let's start a route. Let's end a route. And you can see that here's our items. Now the problem with these items from Virtual Earth is that they actually come with a little bit of HTML wrapped around them. I don't want to get into stripping that HTML off them right now, but hopefully you can see that we've got depart B3151 Costello Hill toward B3151, and then we've got bear right onto some road, and then we've got arrive. Those are our actions. If we stripped that HTML out, that would look a lot better. But basically we've got that list box, and I've kind of just shown you how we can bind to data items so simply. It's just a bit unfortunate they contain a bit of HTML in them for Bing Maps. That only happens actually in the US and Europe, I think. I think if you're elsewhere in the world that wouldn't happen. Okay, so we kind of got our route planning on there. Where could we go next with this? Let's just shut down a few windows. Now, one of the things that's happening in the application at the moment that's not really very nice, if you press F5 and just run the application back up, and we go and zoom in somewhere and just very quickly pick out some roads, so just start a route from here, end a route over here, is that whilst it's calculating that route, we don't get any kind of notification the application's kind of busy. There's lots of ways that a UI designer might do that, but one of the things we could do is we could use something from the Silverlight toolkit, which is one of the things that we downloaded and installed earlier on, one of the things that I had a link for. So let's take a look at that, because it kind of brings in the idea of using things from the toolkit. So in order to do that, let me go over to my solution over here. And what I'll do is add another reference to another assembly, another library. So add a reference. But this one should already be installed on the .NET tab because we've installed the toolkit. And what we're looking for is system. Let's just scroll down in here because it's easier to do it that way. I'm looking for system.windows.controls.toolkit. There's a whole bunch of things in the Silverlight toolkit, and the one thing I'm going to use here is a control called a busy indicator. So let's just take this from the toolkit, so we'll say OK. And that gives us the ability to use this busy indicator. And the way I'll use it here is just by going back to my main page. And kind of like the tooling did for us when we wanted to use something from the maps control, now I want to use something from the toolkit. So what I'll do is go and define an XML namespace mapping. So what we say is just XML and S. Let's say toolkit equals, and Visual Studio will give you help here, and I'm just scrolling down looking for system.windows.controls. Let's see if I can find that somewhere in here. There. No, not that one. System.windows.controls. This one here. System.windows.controls from system.windows.controls.toolkit. That's what I want. So let's just double click on that. And that gives me this toolkit mapping here. And what I could then do is wrap my UI in one of these busy indicators from the toolkit. So let's go and wrap the whole UI. I'm not too fussy about this. Let's say toolkit : now you may not get IntelliSense on this. I'm going to build, so I'm just going to do build and build just to see if that picks things up. And let's just try a colon there again. I'm not getting IntelliSense on this, but there is a class in here called the busy indicator. And all I'm going to do is wrap that round that grid. So we have the grid, which I can collapse down, and now we've got a busy indicator wrapped around that grid. Let's just make sure I can build. Again, this is on the build menu, or you can always just hit F6 and that will build for you, so that should build. Okay, so we've got this busy indicator, and the busy indicator has a property on it called isBusy. And what we'll do is data bind this. So let's say binding to, let's just say something like calculating route. So we've now got this property called calculating route. If we're calculating a route, we are busy. And the busy indicator can display the content for when it's not busy. That will be this. You can also specify content for when it is busy, or it has default content if you want to be lazy. So we'll be lazy. Let's think about this property calculating route. So let's go back to our data. Over we go to route data. And we need a property on here now, excuse me, calculating route. So let's add a boolean, public bool calculating route. And we'll write a getter on that. And basically that's just saying return this dot interaction status equals, if I remember rightly, calculating route. I can just shorten that code down slightly for you. So if this is our current status, then we are calculating a route and the UI is busy. We need to make sure now that when we change the interaction status, we ensure that this property is change notified. So let's go down to our interaction status, and we make sure that it raises the property change for calculating route. Just want to make 100% sure that we got that name right. Is that what I just called that property? Yes, it is. Alright, so let's see what we've done and whether that's worked for us. So go back into the UI, it's all kind of as it was. We scroll in, let's go and find some kind of route. And we want to mark a start route. Let's go zooming across the country, going on a long walk here. And let's mark end route as here. And we should see busy indication. And you can see there it is. The default UI is just please wait. And now we've got busy indication for the UI. So it's very, very simple to add. And once again, we use data binding to make that work. We just set a property in the data and the UI updates to reflect that.